Welcome back to the deep dive. One of the things I love about our listeners is that you all love to learn. You're curious, you want to understand things in depth, but you also appreciate getting right to the heart of it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Nobody has time for information overload. Our listeners want those aha moments, those flashes of insight that make things click. And today's deep dive, I think it's going to deliver some of those.
Definitely. We're going to be taking a look at something that seems really familiar, fairy tales and myths, but we're going to be looking at them through a really fascinating lens, the psychology of Carl Jung.
Yeah. We've got some incredible sources that really dissect these stories and uncover some surprising depths to them. Think of it like this. We all know the basic plots, right? But what if there's a whole hidden language we've been missing?
Exactly, and that's what we're going to be exploring. How these stories, these seemingly simple narratives, actually reflect universal patterns of the human psyche.
Yeah. And how they can offer some really profound insights into ourselves and the world around us. It's not just kid stuff. This is deep stuff.
So, where do we even begin with this? Let's talk Jung. What are some of his core ideas that are going to help us understand all of this?
Well, one of the most important concepts that Jung introduced was the idea of the collective unconscious.
Okay, I've heard that term thrown around a lot. What does it actually mean, though?
Well, imagine it like this. You have your own personal conscious mind, right? All your thoughts and memories and experiences. But Jung believed that beneath that, there's this deeper layer, this vast reservoir of ancestral memories, images, patterns, instincts that are shared by all humans.
Like a universal library of human experience, almost.
Precisely. And within this collective unconscious, he said, we find these universal patterns he called archetypes.
Archetypes, okay.
These are like fundamental blueprints for human experience, recurring themes and figures that show up in cultures all over the world throughout history. It's pretty mind-blowing when you start to see them everywhere.
So how do fairy tales and myths connect to all of this?
Well, Jung believed that fairy tales and myths are actually direct expressions of this collective unconscious. It's like these deep-seated archetypal images and patterns are bubbling up to the surface, finding their way into stories that we've been telling and retelling for centuries.
That's fascinating. So these stories aren't just made-up entertainment. They're like windows into the human psyche itself.
Exactly. And they often play out, in very symbolic ways, the fundamental challenges and the major stages of psychological development that we all go through as humans. The struggles, the triumphs, the transformations. It's all there in these stories, often disguised as magical creatures and fantastical quests.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this works. So if fairy tales are like these symbolic journeys, what's the typical structure that we see? I mean, you think about all the classic fairy tales, and they do seem to follow a similar kind of path.
You're right. There is often a hero or a heroine who often starts out in some sort of humble or marginalized position. Think of Cinderella or the youngest son in so many tales.
Right. They're kind of underestimated or overlooked at the beginning.
Exactly. And then there's some kind of crisis or a sense of lack that forces them to leave their familiar surroundings and embark on a journey. They're thrust out into the unknown.
Yeah.
A classic example is Beauty and the Beast.
Beauty going to the Beast's castle.
Yeah. And as they venture out, they inevitably encounter a series of archetypal figures. Jung identified several key figures that pop up again and again in these stories. There's often a wise old sage or mentor figure who offers guidance. Think about Dumbledore in Harry Potter or Merlin in the Arthurian legends.
Someone who appears when the hero needs help the most.
Exactly. And then there's the shadow figure, the antagonist, the villain who represents the hero's unacknowledged fears or darker impulses.
Like the big bad wolf or the evil stepmother.
Precisely. The shadow figure embodies all those negative aspects of the psyche that we try to suppress or deny, but they always have to be confronted.
It's interesting. It's almost like these figures are externalizations of our own internal struggles.
Absolutely. And throughout the journey, the hero faces tests and trials that force them to grow, to discover their hidden strengths, and ultimately to confront and overcome their shadow. It's a process of psychological transformation.
So they're not just passive characters in a story, they're actively working towards something.
Right. They have to work for their happy ending, and if they succeed, they ultimately achieve their goal. They find the treasure, they rescue the princess, they defeat the evil monster, whatever it may be.
They bring balance back to the kingdom.
Exactly. And they return home transformed. They're not the same naive person who set out on the journey. They've gained knowledge, wisdom, experience.
They've leveled up.
That's a great way to put it. They've leveled up. And this whole structure, the sources point out, really mirrors ancient rites of passage. You have the separation from the familiar, then a liminal phase of trials and challenges, and finally a return to society, but in a new and elevated role.
It's like symbolic death and rebirth.
Yes. And it aligns perfectly with Jung's concept of individuation, which is the process of becoming a whole and integrated self. That feeling of lack that sets the hero on their journey, that's like the starting point for individuation, and all the challenges they face. Those are the trials and tribulations of integrating all the different aspects of the psyche into a cohesive whole.
So it's like these fairy tales are speaking to our own existential questions. The heroes are like different facets of our own personalities, and the adventures are metaphors for the inner conflicts that we all face.
Precisely. And one of the things that Jung and a lot of the sources we're looking at today really emphasized was the therapeutic potential of these stories.
Yeah. How so?
Well, by understanding these archetypes and these symbolic journeys, we can gain a deeper understanding of our own psychological landscape. We can start to recognize the patterns that are playing out in our own lives, and perhaps even find ways to work with those patterns in a more conscious and constructive way.
So it's not just about analyzing these stories intellectually. It's about using them as tools for self-discovery and even for personal growth.
Exactly. And I think that's where it gets really exciting. It's like unlocking a secret code within these familiar narratives, a code that can help us understand ourselves and live more fulfilling lives.
Okay. So let's take a specific example. Let's talk about Cinderella. It's a story that almost everyone knows, and it's full of these archetypal images and themes that we've been talking about.
Yeah, Cinderella is a perfect example. It's so rich with symbolism. Right from the start, we see Cinderella in this state of subjugation. She's mistreated by her stepmother and stepsisters, forced to do all the menial chores, confined to the ashes of the hearth.
It's almost like she's being punished for simply existing.
Right. And psychologically, this can be seen as the conscious part of herself being dominated by these negative psychic forces, maybe unresolved emotional issues or aspects of her personality that she's trying to ignore or suppress.
It's like those negative voices in our heads that tell us we're not good enough or that we don't deserve to be happy.
Exactly. And Cinderella herself, toiling away in those ashes, she represents the unrecognized, creative, and luminous part of her psyche, the potential that's being suppressed and undervalued.
Even her name, Cinderella, is derived from cinder, which relates to ashes. It's like she's literally covered in the remnants of what's been burned away. But those ashes also contain the potential for new life.
That's a great point. And the invitation to the ball, that pivotal moment in the story, that's like a call to individuation. A summons from the deeper self to step into her true nature and realize her full potential.
It's that feeling that we all have sometimes, that there's something more to life, something more to ourselves.
Precisely. And of course, Cinderella can't go to the ball in her rags. She needs help.
Enter the fairy godmother.
Exactly. The fairy godmother. Now, she is fascinating from a Jungian perspective. She's seen as an embodiment of the anima. That's the inner feminine principle within all of us, regardless of gender.
So even men have an anima.
Absolutely. The anima represents qualities like intuition, creativity, nurturing. And the fairy godmother, she represents this powerful, transforming side of the anima. Her magic, the pumpkin turning into a carriage, the mice into horses, these are all symbols of the transformative power of archetypal energy at work within the psyche. That potential for profound change that we all possess.
It's like that spark of inspiration that can suddenly change everything.
Exactly. And the ball itself, with all its beauty and splendor that represents an experience of the self, that radiant wholeness that the psyche naturally strives for, it's a glimpse of Cinderella's true potential, a taste of belonging and joy.
But then midnight strikes and the spell is broken, back to reality, back to those ashes.
Right. And that moment of vanishing, that return to her former state, that symbolizes the necessary separation and differentiation from those negative entities that were holding her back. It's a crucial step in establishing a stronger sense of self.
It's like realizing that you can't stay in that blissful bubble forever. You have to come back down to earth and deal with the reality of your situation.
And then comes the glass slipper.
Which some analyses interpret as a fur slipper.
Yes, exactly. But regardless of the material, the slipper, with its unique fit and fragility, symbolizes the delicacy and the uniqueness of the individual soul, Cinderella's true identity. And the stepsisters trying to force their feet into it, they represent those false selves that are trying to appropriate her authentic being.
How many of us try to squeeze ourselves into roles or identities that don't truly fit us?
So many of us. And the prince, of course, represents the integrated masculine principle. And their marriage is seen as the alchemical wedding, the union of consciousness and the unconscious, the masculine and feminine within, leading to the accomplishment of the self.
It's amazing how every little detail in the story, even the slipper, holds so much symbolic weight.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the ashes earlier. The ashes, according to some of the sources we're looking at, can be linked to the alchemical concept of nigredo. That's a stage of darkness and dissolution that's often necessary for any true transformation to take place. It's like the breakdown before the breakthrough.
So even the bad stuff, the difficult times, they can actually be part of the process.
Exactly. And the three balls that Cinderella tends that can be seen as representing the three phases of alchemical work. There's nigredo, that initial darkness. Then there's albedo, a stage of purification. And finally, rubedo, the final stage of integration and wholeness.
It all ties together so beautifully. Okay, so we've talked about fairy tales. They often focus on that individual journey. What about myths? How do they fit into all of this?
Myths, like fairy tales, are also powerful expressions of the collective unconscious, but they tend to have a broader scope. They often explore the origins of the world, the fundamental forces that govern the universe, and they feature gods and heroes who embody these archetypal principles in a grander way.
So if fairy tales are like personal dramas, myths are more like cosmic operas.
I like that analogy. It's like they're operating on a different scale. And the gods and goddesses of mythology, they can be seen as these amplified, personified versions of the archetypes that we've been talking about.
So like Zeus representing power and authority, Hera representing marriage and family.
Precisely. Their characteristics, their stories, their interactions,
Hmm.
they're all metaphors for the dynamic interplay of these archetypal forces within each of us.
I've always been fascinated by the Greek pantheon, all those gods and goddesses squabbling and scheming on Mount Olympus.
It's classic drama, and if you look at it through a Jungian lens, it's almost like watching those different aspects of our own psyches interacting with each other, sometimes harmoniously, sometimes in conflict, just like in real life.
And the heroes in these myths, like Hercules or Odysseus, they're also larger-than-life figures facing incredible challenges.
Right. And their journeys, they often represent the struggles of the self against these powerful unconscious forces. Think of Hercules battling the Hydra or Odysseus resisting the Sirens.
It's like they're fighting our battles for us on a symbolic level.
In a way, yes. And by telling and retelling these stories, myths not only reflect these archetypal patterns, but they also give them form and power. They anchor these models in our collective imagination.
And you mentioned earlier that founding myths like creation stories have a really profound impact on how we see the world.
Absolutely. Myths that explain the birth of the cosmos, they establish these fundamental archetypal structures. The emergence of order from chaos, the separation of heaven and earth, the cyclical nature of time. These patterns, they continue to influence our thinking even if we don't consciously believe in the literal stories anymore.
It's like they're baked into our cultural DNA. And then you have those epic heroic myths, like the Odyssey or the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Those are classic examples of the hero's journey just played out on this grand scale, and they provide this archetypal map of human development and individuation.
So it's like we're hardwired to respond to these stories, to find meaning and inspiration in them, no matter what culture we come from, no matter what time period we live in.
Exactly. The themes are universal, the struggles are universal, and the potential for transformation is universal.
Can we talk about a specific myth? Maybe something a little bit darker, more complex, like the story of Oedipus. How does that fit into all of this?
Oedipus is fascinating because his story concentrates so many fundamental archetypal issues into one really intense narrative. You have the mystery of origins and identity, the rebellion against the father figure, the unconscious desire for the mother. It's all there.
Yeah, it's a pretty heavy story, but it's also one that has resonated with people for centuries.
And I think that's because it touches on these very primal, very human themes. Oedipus, in unknowingly killing his father and marrying his mother, he actualizes this universal unconscious fantasy, the desire for incest, that yearning for a primal, undifferentiated connection. But he's also this relentless seeker of truth. He's determined to uncover his true identity no matter the cost.
And the cost is pretty high.
It is. And his story and his tragic nature really highlights the tension within the human condition, the pull between our instincts and our conscious awareness, the struggle to integrate all the different parts of ourselves into a cohesive whole.
It's like Oedipus is both a warning and an inspiration. A warning about the dangers of unchecked impulses, but also an inspiration to face the truth about ourselves no matter how difficult it may be.
Exactly. And I think that's a powerful message that resonates with all of us on some level.
Okay, so we've talked about the core concepts. We've looked at examples in fairy tales and myths. What about the practical applications? How can understanding this Jungian perspective on stories actually be useful in our everyday lives? What's in it for our listeners?
Yeah, that's the key question. How can we take all of this heady stuff and actually apply it to our own lives?
Well, one of the key takeaways from all of this is that understanding the archetypal logic within these stories can give us a powerful framework for interpreting our own experiences. We can start to see the recurring patterns, the familiar characters, the challenges that we face as expressions of these universal archetypes and these timeless journeys.
It's like we can start to see the bigger picture, the underlying themes that are playing out in our own personal narratives. Precisely. And this can be incredibly helpful in navigating life's challenges. For example, if you're going through a period of transition or upheaval, you might recognize that you're in that Cinderella phase of being confined to the ashes. And that can help you to understand what's happening on a deeper level and to perhaps even see the potential for transformation that exists within that difficult situation.
It's like having a roadmap for your own personal hero's journey.
Exactly. And the sources also point out that fairy tales and myths can be very powerful therapeutic tools. They can be used to bring unconscious dynamics to light in a safe, symbolic way.
I'm curious about that. How would that work in practice?
Well, for example, a therapist might invite a client to identify with a particular hero or heroine and to explore their journey. This can create a distance that allows for examining the client's own inner conflicts and potential pathways to resolution.
It's like using the story as a mirror to reflect back the client's own inner world.
Exactly. And the therapist might also suggest alternative scenarios, like what if Cinderella had stood up to her stepmother, or what if Oedipus had chosen to ignore the prophecy? This can help the client to see that they have choices, that they have the power to shape their own story.
It's a way of empowering them to take control of their own lives. The sources also talked about using other specific myths like Inanna's descent into the underworld or the archetype of a solar hero like Apollo.
Right. For someone who's going through a dark night of the soul, the myth of Inanna's descent and her eventual return can be a powerful symbol of hope and renewal. It shows that even in the darkest of times, there is always the possibility of rebirth and transformation. And for someone who's struggling to find their voice or to assert themselves, the archetype of Apollo, the god of light and music and poetry, can be a source of inspiration and strength.
So it's really about finding the stories that resonate with us personally and using them as tools for self-discovery and growth.
Exactly. It's about making these ancient narratives come alive in our own lives.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways for our listeners? What do we want them to walk away with?
First and foremost, I think it's important to remember that fairy tales and myths are far more than just whimsical stories or outdated legends. They're deeply rooted in the collective unconscious, and they reveal profound psychological truths about the human experience.
Truths that are just as relevant today as they were centuries ago.
Absolutely. And the characters and events within these stories, they're not random. They symbolize these universal archetypes and the fundamental processes that we all go through in our lives, like the journey of individuation and the process of integrating our shadow selves.
And by understanding this Jungian lens, we gain a valuable tool for self-understanding and for navigating life's challenges. These ancient stories become like guides or mirrors reflecting back the often unseen dynamics of our own inner lives.
And as we've discussed, they also hold tremendous therapeutic potential, offering a powerful symbolic way to explore our unconscious dynamics, to stimulate our capacity for growth, and to facilitate meaningful change.
So, ultimately, these ancient narratives aren't just relics of the past. They transmit timeless wisdom about resilience, about transformation, about the power of the human spirit to overcome adversity and to find its true potential.
Precisely. And by consciously reconnecting with these stories, we're actually reactivating those archetypal energies within ourselves.
It's like tapping into a source of ancient wisdom that's been flowing through humanity for centuries.
Exactly. And I think that's a pretty powerful idea.
So here's a final thought for you, our listener. Think about a fairy tale or a myth that has always resonated with you, one that you've always found particularly compelling.
Really bring that story to mind. Now, try looking at the characters and the events through this Jungian lens that we've been exploring today. What inner dynamics within yourself might be mirrored in that story? What challenges or potentials might it be reflecting back to you?
It's an invitation to go deeper, to explore the rich landscape of your own psyche through the lens of these timeless narratives. And who knows what surprising insights you might discover along the way. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep pondering those stories.
See you next time.
And keep diving deep.